Hello, and welcome to our first Google Hangout. We are looking forward to discuss with you and have already seen some of your questions on the forum, others here on the Google Hangout itself. You can also post your questions via Twitter, as you know, or via the Facebook site. And we would like to start by looking at some of the questions that you posted on the forum. And there's one discussion that comes time and again, and not just on the forum for this session, but in general, this problem or this question reappears all the time. The difference between ethical, unethical decisions, ethical, unethical people. When we talk about ethical blindness, what you have to keep in mind is that we are assuming that there are two different types of unethical behavior. One type of unethical behavior results from the person's intentions, character, bad, doubtful motivations. So it's a conscious rule breaking, the so-called bad apples that we referred to already. And there's a second one where we would argue the second one has been largely underestimated so far, which is the unconscious decision-making, the unconscious rule-breaking. So we are not claiming that all the rule-breaking suddenly is unconscious. We are only saying that there are two types, and we focus too much on the bad apples. Our knee-jerk reaction in the corporate scandal is to talk about bad apples instead of contexts. And our course has the intention to shift this focus a bit to this other dimension, to see what can we say about context that contribute to bad or unethical decisions, not so much character of persons. A bad person, what is a bad person, what is a good person? Well, Ulrich will say a bit more about our understanding of unethical decisions or evil right after me, but maybe one point for the unethical person. As I said, of course, there are people that break the rules intentionally, that are driven by greed, or that who enjoy see the other suffering. This is what we would roughly describe as the bad people. The good people that break the rules are the ones that are for us interesting in our course. Again, we do not deny the existence of the others, but we are more interested in the other dimension, because it is simply not really sexy to discuss why bad people do bad things. It's much more exciting to think about the good people doing bad things, because then you can think about yourself, maybe. So Ulrich, maybe you continue with this question.
Yeah, hello also from my side. What Guido just said, I think, summarizes in a nutshell what we had in our model on ethical blindness. It's not about bad people, it's about, in a way, bad context. We integrate psychology, philosophy, and I think it's important to mention here that the psychological part, so understanding why people, good people, do unethical things, is not excusiology. So this is something I heard from Zimbardo, whom we will meet later in this course. Psychology is not excusiology. We use a lot of psychology to understand why people, good people, do bad things, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't be responsible for it. We can say that's excusable. If you want to ask yourself, is something I'm doing ethical or unethical, here's a guiding question you might want to use. And that's the old Latin question, cui bono, who benefits? If you can honestly answer this question, I do it because someone else should benefit from this decision, from my action. I do it for someone else. It's likely to be ethical or more on the ethical side, whereas if you have to admit, in fact, I'm doing this because I want to get something out of this. I'm doing this for self-interest. Then chances are that it's not only ethical. You may be ethical if you do not harm someone. But if you just do it for selfish reasons, this is definitely interest and not value. Values are social. Values are other regarding. Values is something you can universalize, that benefit others, where you would see a stable world where all would benefit and not just individuals who fight against each other. Yeah.
Yes, maybe to add one point. In other forums, there was a discussion to which I attributed some ideas as well. The discussion on whether the fact that my position collides with your position is a situation potentially of ethical blindness, and the answer is no. Because if it's my values against your values, this is just a value conflict, but it's not ethical blindness, because ethical blindness by definition has to do with my own values. I must deviate from my own values, from my inner perspective. I cannot deviate from your values. That doesn't make sense.
And to add on that, you would, if you're in the state of ethical blindness, you would not even realize that you do something unethical. So it's very hard to become aware of that.
There was also a discussion about the point of whether ethical blindness is a situation, a state, or a process. If you look careful on the article that's behind our course and that you find in the reading, Ethical Blindness, the one we wrote together with our colleague Franziska Krings, then you will see that we describe it as both. We describe it as a state. Someone is in an ethical blindness state. But if you ask yourself, how do you get into that state, then you are in the process mood, and you have to ask what drives this process. And we will hear next week about the impact of time on unethical decision making, on ethical blindness. And you will see that there are temporal dynamics that explain the transition from seeing that something is right or wrong to not seeing it anymore. Ethical blindness, also a point you discussed online, ethical blindness often starts with someone doing the wrong thing and knowing that it's wrong, but over time losing the ability to see it. As one of the Enron traders once said, you do it once, it smells, you do it again, it smells less.
Maybe to add on that, you may know that there is a lot of testing going on. Psychologists are known for applying tests and intelligence tests, for instance. And often people walk out of such a test and they have a number, they IQ, they score. So this is how intelligent they are, and they get a number. Actually, we haven't discussed that. I would refuse any attempts to design a test where you walk out after having filled out some forms with a number telling you where you are on the ethical blindness scale from 0 to 100. I think that doesn't work. Maybe it is fair to say that there is individual differences. Some people are more, let's say, prone to consider their own interest. Others are more other regarding. Certainly there is variance when it comes to traits, but in our model, I think the state is at least equally important. It's largely driven by context, and context changes over time. And this is why I would refuse to give a number that would be stable and would in a way ignore the temporal influences.
Yeah, you would probably put the whole big story into a narrow frame of quantifiable data, which probably doesn't make that much sense. There was one question about fear in the forum. How do you reduce fear in organizations? As you remember, in several videos, we stated that one of the key driving forces of ethical blindness is fear. Because fear does two things. It reinforces the narrowness of your frame, and it keeps you from saying what you might want to say, but you don't dare to. And over time, if you create a culture of fear, the idea of saying something that you believe is inappropriate in that context might disappear overall. So what can you do if you want to design a context that reduces fear? But one of the things that we have seen in all the scandals that we discussed so far and are going to discuss in the following parts of the course is that in situations where people feel ambivalence about the rules and are under pressure, there's a higher probability of ethical blindness. If there's ambivalence, you move in the gray zone between right and wrong. And if you then are pushed, you easily move towards the dark side. So reducing ambivalence, making developing clear rules of the game takes away uncertainty, and uncertainty drives fear as well. Allow for mistakes. A lot of people have fear because they have the impression they cannot make mistakes in their context. Do not incentivize aggressive behavior, aggressive leadership. Promote discussions and self-reflection. Open the organization or the team to dissenting voices so that you hear other positions and not necessarily the ones of your own group. So refer to out-group people, to listen to them, the capacity to listen. If you send the signal as a leader that you don't listen, you promote fear as well. So whatever drives broader perception of my context helps against fear as well. So fear is something that you should certainly not use as a leadership tool in your organization.
To add on that, fear, what you said at the very end with this horizon, whether you have a narrow or broad horizon. I earlier addressed the question, how can I understand whether I'm myself doing something ethically or unethically? And I think it is related here. With a narrow horizon, you're likely to be more unethical, or let's say, you're more likely to consider yourself and your own interest compared to with a wider horizon, because with a wider horizon, you see the social environment, you see the other people around you, which in a way facilitates ethical dimensions, or which brings ethical dimensions into the equations. When it comes to fear, of course, is associated with survival. So if we look at this from an evolutionary biology background, fear is important for us in situations where there is danger, some threat from outside, and we react. We have to react fast. We have to run away, escape the danger. And this is usually not the situation where you are able to think, to reflect, to look at others, to look at the common good, the greater welfare. It's about getting out of that. And it's important to have these instincts. So if you're living in such a situation in a company where there is this, let's say, culture of fear, it's even harder. So the challenge is even bigger to get out of this mode and to adapt this wider perspective.
If you, as you will see next in the coming weeks, when we talk about the situational factors that drive ethical blindness, and when we talk about Zimbardo and his experiments, that courage is a key element of waking up and of protecting yourself. And as we also have seen when we discussed dilemma situations, courage is not taken for granted. A lot of you posted dilemmas where you granted that one or the other answer would be the right one, but there is fear. There is a lack of courage. There is so much pressure from your peers or your leader, which shows the importance of courage for making good ethical decisions. Because if ethical decisions would be easy, everyone would do it. There was one debate, not only on this forum, but again on some other posts in the forum, on the story of the Pinto. And some of you challenged the idea that the engineers could be in a state of ethical blindness when they made their decision. One of you asked, I guess it was Marcella, how can you be in a state of ethical blindness when you see these accidents, when you see the victims and these cars, devastated cars coming in as a callback engineer? Well, you should not forget that at that time, people were convinced that there are two reasons why accidents happen. Reason number one, bad streets. Reason number two, bad drivers. So even if you see the Pinto coming in with this devastating accident and you know about the people who died in the car, you still can be convinced that this is horrible, but it has nothing to do with you, because accidents are about drivers and cars. Well, you can ask yourself, why did people believe at the time that drivers and cars are the reason for accidents? And then we are in lobbyism debates, but that's not the topic here. There are some other aspects that you might keep in mind. In the 1970s, the early 1970s, all cars were more or less unsafe. So the perception that it is risky to drive a car was taken for granted. If you drive a car, you accept the risk of dying. The Pinto was only a little bit more unsafe than the other cars, a bit beyond the limit, but not much. So it more or less fits into the frame of how people perceive cars at that time anyway. Driving a car is not safe. And it is perceived by customers as a risk that they take voluntarily. And you remember also the fact that we discussed that if you ask customers, would you prefer a safer car or a larger trunk, they would normally choose the trunk in the early 1970s. Put all these factors together, plus the leadership style in the organization, plus the time pressure, plus the high complexity, plus the fact that they had a standard operating procedure that did not fit the case. You remember, cars that should be called back had to have a problem that was traceable and frequent. Both was not given at the Pinto because the Pinto as such was a problem and it was not frequent. Take all these things together and you can still see this car coming in and you believe it is not your problem. You have nothing to do with it. You can disconnect, you feel well, you're blind. Only afterwards, when you yourself reconstruct all these factors and you compare your behavior with what you believe right now after the situation, then you might ask yourself, how could I ever do this? That's what these engineers ask themselves. And this is what is a ever-returning question that people very often ask when they come out of bad behavior, of scandals. How could I ever do this? How could I get involved in this? Of course, and this leads to another discussion we had on the forums. This can be ex post rationalization, but ex post rationalization explains only a little bit of what we can observe here. If you just look at the experiments done by psychologists, we talk about them in the coming weeks, and you see these students participating when they get the debriefing right after the experiment is stopped, you see that they are shocked by themselves. You see it in their faces. So there is no ex post rationalization here. It's just shame.
Yeah, maybe one comment on that. Today we can look at this and say there's a scandal. Pinto, they made it to the front news. The engineers, who and how could they have done it? But just think about yourself or the two of us. I mean, when we have to make a decision, we want to visit a friend 200 miles apart. Do we go there by train or by car? Honestly, if you wonder which mean of transportation you should use, do you have an ethical dimension when facing the decision whether or not you should take the car? Does it occur to you that using the car you might kill another person in an accident? Probably not, because as Guido said, these are so low frequent event. And I would not say you are doing something unethical by using the car. Of course, you can kill someone with a car, probably not with the train if you're just a passenger in the train, but no one would call this an unethical behavior, taking the car. And with the Pinto, it's a bit like this. So we are talking about events, low frequent events, accidents do happen, and it's about causal attribution. For a long time, they didn't even know whether the chances of dying in a Pinto were higher compared to other cars. Mm. So we do not want to say they've done something unethical. At the moment, however, it appears on their radar screen. Once they have the statistics is big enough. They know there's the design flaw. They know they can fix it, and they do the calculation how much does it cost to continue like this and to pay the money for to cover the accidents or to repair the car. Once they think about it, then it becomes an ethical issue. But then you may argue it's may still not be a very good example of ethical blindness, because once you calculate it's cheaper and you're ruthless, then I would say it's not ethical blindness, it's selfish behavior, also on the level of the company. It is an issue of ethical blindness if you do the calculation and you do not focus on the human lives, but you just look at the money. So if your focus is on the money, and you ignore the human side, the ethical side, then I would say it's a very good example for ethical blindness.
We have a question from Mohammed on Google. And Mohammed is asking, if you are subordinate in a big multinational corporation, how can you stop unethical decision makings? And how can you avoid situations like the ones we described at Ford and Lehman and Enron? But you can look at this from two perspectives, in my view. You can look at this from the leader, and leader means on all levels. You lead a team, you lead the whole organization and everything in between, and from the person who is led by others. As a leader, you might contribute to the existence of such strong context. As a follower, you have to ask yourself, how do I avoid becoming a victim of such a context? What you have to do, and we will talk about this when we come to solutions in the last week of our course, is you have to observe the constellations of all these factors that we have described so far and are going to describe afterwards in the coming videos. So we talked about organizational factors like incentives, aggressive language, bonus systems, evaluation systems, leadership. We will talk about time pressure and group pressure. So if you imagine constellations of all these factors pushing you into one, namely the unethical direction, it's probably too late if the context is strong enough, but you can see it coming if you carefully observe these factors building up around you in any organization. And as someone who makes leadership decisions, you can ask yourself, how do my decisions, the systems I set in place, the way I lead people, the way I talk, how do these things contribute to ethical blindness? Because I'm very convinced that most of the time, these people do not realize that they contribute to the unethical behavior of their team members. The emperor in our fairy tale, he probably did not have the intention that people lied to him out of fear. But that's the context he created. And as you have seen, he became a victim of this context himself. He had fear himself. So the context strikes back on him. He's stronger than the person creating the context. So this would be one of my answers here.
Okay. There's another question I wanted to address, and I think I now have to press this one here.
Yes.
And okay, right. Okay, so the question Olga raised it, is it possible to avoid framing at all? Has a framing any benefit? Of course, frames have benefits. We need frames. We cannot avoid having frames. Frames allow us to perceive the world, to construct reality. And reality is so complex. There's so many information coming in. We need to structure it. We need to select. We need to filter our attention. There's nothing bad about using frames. They make us more efficient. And the recommendation is not avoid being framed. The recommendation we have is become aware of your frames. Try to see and reflect on yourself how you see the world. Because the risk is with a certain frame, you may ignore ethical dimensions. So if you look for money, 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 and how I can increase my profits, you may look a little bit less on the stakeholders and who has to pay the price so that you get more profit, right? So the more you focus on your profit, the more likely it is that these other aspects are blinded out, that you do not see them. So keep your frames. There's nothing bad about frames, but try to be aware of your frames. And this is something, of course, you cannot do at the same moment. Probably you just have your frames, you need them over the day to function. But in a silent moment, you may try to step back. You may try to look at your life, to reflect on how you look at the world. And what helps here a great deal, and we discussed this in the video, is to confront yourself with others who think differently, with whom you continually disagree. It's useful to travel. It's useful to talk to others who are affected by your decisions. All that may help out to you to widen your frame. Widen your frame basically means adapting more frames so that you can play with the frames.
There was a question from John, who I have to go to this question first. So John is asking whether it isn't a paradox that companies like Enron, on the one hand, have these narrow frames, while at the same time, they were driven by the idea that they have to break the old frames, because for them, new frames have to be applied to open up, to be innovative, to drive something very new and exciting. The paradox that I see in the Enron story and in many other stories is rather the opposite, that they make this kind of claim, but at the same time, they are driven by exactly the frame they want to go beyond. The frame was the frame of profit maximization, short-term profit maximization. It was a frame that we will discuss later in this course as the shareholder value ideology, which includes also the idea that rules are bad, governments are bad. They prevent you from being free on markets, and markets are the ones that promote property. Property is the most important human right. So you see, there is a frame that is driven by the idea of deregulation, cleverness, greed, which is not so much different from what happened in other companies. It's more a kind of exaggeration of this dominating frame. It's not a new frame. But I would agree that if there is a new frame, if you systematically try to break the frame that dominates an industry, if you are the one who comes with a killer application, then you, of course, you look much broader. But this is one frame, and this one frame might not necessarily include ethics. So you can be the person or the organization that comes with a killer application and still don't see the ethical dimension of what you are doing, because you still might believe this is a new system of new behavior with new rules, and the old rules don't count for you. The problem that you normally have with narrow frames is not only the frame itself that is narrow, but the inability to shift to another frame, to change the perspective, to do what Hannah Arendt called applying moral imagination, to look at the question not just from an economic perspective, but maybe then from an engineering perspective, then from a legal perspective, from a moral one. So switching between frames is a good protection. You might not be able to do this alone, so you need different people communicating with each other with different experience, different frames, different backgrounds, but then you get the broader vision of what you should do.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that and also include some other questions that have been posted before. Framing is not only an individual process that you as an individual frame the world, look at the world. It is also a social process. How we frame or how we look at the world, we communicate, we talk to each other, we use language. And I think it's very important to consider here these social aspects. Yeah, and one of these social aspects is covered by something that has been brought up in an earlier question in the forum about language. One of you, who was it? I wrote on the name. Where is my... I don't find it. No, here. No, I do not. Anyway, one of you brought up, sorry, guys. One of you brought up the issue of journalism. What is the responsibility of journalists? And I would say it's a very, very, very important role that journalists play, because they, in a way, do not really control, but they have an influence on how we in society look at things. They, in a way, shape our frames or contribute to the frames we have, we use, we apply. And we talked about apples, we talked about barrels, we talked about barrel makers. So in a way, journalists could maybe be seen as frame makers. They, in a way, can select which frames are more dominant in society. And here they have a very important role in democracy also. No? It's about discourse, it's about discussion. And I want to say something more about language, because some of you also raised the question, is there empirical evidence about the importance of framing? Does framing make a difference? It is correct. In the video, we provided a case study. The case study is, in my view, or in our view, very powerful illustrations what frames can do. There's, of course, also empirical evidence out there. There's an experiment in which language has been manipulated. And here you must understand that very important tool here is the use of metaphors. Metaphors may help to select frames. And I would like to draw your attention to a study conducted by Thibault McClelland, and third author, Bordowski, I think. And what these, Thibault, McClelland, Boroditsky, sorry, from Stanford universities. What they did, they ran an experiment, and they gave students, more than 400, a short description about crime. And the basic question was then at the end, what should we do about it? And I just read you, these are only two sentences. Crime is a wild beast preying on the city of Edison. The crime rate in the once peaceful city has steadily increased over the past 3 years. In fact, these days, it seems that crime is lurking in every neighborhood. And so it goes on, some numbers, and then the question is what to do. That was one condition. I remember two important things here. Crime is a wild beast preying on, and it is lurking. Another condition, they read the following vignette. Crime is a virus infecting the city of Edison. The crime rate in the once peaceful city, In fact, these days, it seems that crime is plaguing every neighborhood. So they only changed two little words. But what you see here is by using different metaphor, one from medicine and the other from criminology, frames us. Frames us means make us see this differently. And when it came to the question, what should we do about it? It's interesting that the answers differed dramatically. So they basically had two different ways to handle that. One was stricter enforcement. So here we're talking about policy, arresting, prisons, police. And the other is with a social frame, have rehabilitation program, facilitate communication within the community and all that. And guess, I think the prediction is quite clear, with a medical frame, virus, it was more likely that people responded to do something about the social situation. And with the it's a wild beast, people opted for the prisons and for the police option. So here we see the power of language, the power of metaphors on framing. So new questions coming in. I mean, they're coming
maybe to add to this point, because there were several discussions in the fora about this argument that we brought, that language influences ethical blindness. Language influences what we think and what we finally do. And some of you challenged that. So as Ulrich said, there is this rich research in psychology that shows how the use of particular words trigger particular frames, and thereby then particular conclusions, decisions, behaviors. You have linguists who do the similar research, like George Lakoff, in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. He analyzes the impact of words and narratives on how we think and how we make decisions. You have the same discourse in philosophy. Foucault, Wittgenstein, and other philosophers who destroyed this old idea that words are objective and just describe the world. By using words, we are doing something performative. We influence the world by how we use the words. We play what Wittgenstein called language games.
Related to that, there's a literature in psychology on perception and the power that words or categories that we use have on perception. And this is connected to the names Sapir-Whorf. You might have heard about this hypothesis. Just to give you one illustration, people have been shown this thing here, two balls connected. One group has been told this is a pair of glasses. Another has been told this is a handle, so something you use in an exercise room. And later they've been asked to draw the thing. And surprise, surprise, those who have been told it's a glass, they remembered having seen this one. Those who have been told it's a handle, remember they have been seen this one and drew the thing. So here we see that the words we use to label things have even effect on how we perceive things and how we memorize things. Another example, Inuit, Eskimos, they have 16 different words for snow. People in the Arabic world, probably not, right? They have snow and I think that's it. I'm not an expert, I don't know. But here you see the question, how fine-grained our vocabulary determines a lot about what we see. And if we talk about more about ethics, and if we develop a richer vocabulary to describe ethical things, to describe how other people feel about things, we are more likely to see more things. So just to add on that, language, very important.
Titanium has asked an interesting question. How are the contexts formed? By bad people, good people, or spontaneously? Well, my guess here would be, first, you have to remember, we differentiate the interaction between two things, frames and contexts. And there are three types of contexts: the situation, the organization, and society. And our argument is that particular constellations of these three contextual layers make the frame more narrow. So the first answer here is it has to be somehow a combination of pressures from different contexts. Because if you have contradictory pressures from the situation and the organization, then you probably will not become ethically blind. It has to be aligned. Where does it start? Maybe it can start on all three somehow. It can start as an ideological change. Just think about the Enron story and the coincidence of a new economy thinking, the hype about the new world that was appearing with all these old boring industries disappearing, being replaced. So you have a societal change that might support the belief systems that the managers inside, that probably were bad apples, brought with them and then used to create this contagious evil culture. It can also come from inside the organization and develop in an otherwise unaffected societal context, and then look for elements in the societal context supporting it. So it can start everywhere. But the important thing is it has to appear as a combination of factors that get aligned. The situation might have time and group pressure. The organization might contribute incentives and aggressiveness and the leadership style. The society might contribute this idea of deregulation. So it's the right moment, the coincidence of these three factors that explains maybe Lehman Brothers, that explains the story of Enron, that explains, as we have argued, also the Pinto case, with a particular understanding of accidents, of the car industry, of organizations like Ford at that time organized in silos. So you have constellations, and where it starts, maybe everywhere, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is it has to be aligned.
Yeah, maybe this one question here. What's the difference between the concept of ethical blindness and the one of banality of evil? Banality of evil, for those of you who don't know, has been coined by Hannah Arendt, who studied the Holocaust and later detected these were not cruel, evil people, but these were bureaucrats. They were functioning. And this is what Eichmann, in a way, said. I received my orders, I'm functioning. I was part in this big machinery. Has he seen the ethical dimension? I would say this is sort of orthogonal. You may be part of this machinery, and you may be one of these people about which Hannah Arendt wrote, and you might have known what you're doing is not right from an ethical point of view, but you still function because you're in the system and you don't see any way of escaping here. So not necessarily everyone who was functioning in the system has not seen ethical dimensions. This is not what we are saying. They might have continued because they were afraid leaving the system. Some of them might have even believed that this is right what they are doing. So I would say this is orthogonal. Whether you see it or not has nothing to do whether you take your part in the system. What might be added is, of course, if you are in this machinery, in the system, and all people around you have the same frame, they have a shared belief system, this is how you grow up, the propaganda works in this direction. It is likely that you do have a narrow frame and the risk of ethical blindness is increased compared to a society where we can discuss and dispute openly. This is maybe also true.
There's a question of Harsha Swaroop. While in an organization, when we are reporting to two bosses, one boss has different interests, wants to save his job mentality, and pushes me to take decisions which isn't in the interest of the organization, but he's reporting to the same boss. So if I understand this question correctly, this is one in which you have two bosses that give you contradictory orders. Maybe one of them pushing in the wrong direction, the other one less or not at all. What comes to my mind when I read this description is the following. The German philosopher Hegel once said that the slave of two masters is a free man. Why is the slave of two masters a free man? Because if the two masters give contradictory orders, the slave must choose. And if the slave can choose, he's no longer a slave. So my spontaneous assumption would be, if you are in a situation where you have contradictory orders from bosses that push you in different directions, it at least helps you not to fall into ethical blindness, because it wakes you up for tangents, for contradictions. They're not aligned in what they ask you to do. On the other side, depending on who is stronger of these two bosses, this might create a culture of ambivalence that then is not very healthy for you as a person. So probably it's not a good situation where you should stay, but rather leave. Ori 3374 asked whether the concept of ethical blindness has already been used in a court of justice. There's a chapter in the book of Philip Zimbardo where he describes his experiment, his prison experiment, of which we're going to talk next week, where he describes that he once was asked to write a report on one of the prison guards of Abu Ghraib, and where he used this idea of contextual analysis to demonstrate that this soldier and the other soldiers in Abu Ghraib doings were pushed into that situation by very strong contextual factors. But he concluded his analysis in this book by saying, well, in the end, the judge could not take into consideration this aspect because we cannot bring context to prisons. The awareness for these psychological forces that push people into wrong decisions has probably not yet been acknowledged sufficiently by the legal system. I would like to profit by this question to highlight once again something that Ulrich mentioned already, but that cannot be said often enough. We do not advance this concept of ethical blindness to excuse people who do wrong things by saying, well, it's a context and they are like robots and they react to context. So they still remain guilty for whatever they did. However, we can ask a second normative question. We cannot only ask who is the person who did the wrong thing and thus is guilty. We can also ask who is the one who brought this person into that context, who created that context, who is responsible for the forces that came together, or is one of the responsible actors of the forces behind this strong context, because these persons are also responsible. So we differentiate between this descriptive analysis, understanding why people do not see what they do is wrong, and the normative perspective, when we ask who is responsible, who should be held accountable for what he or she did.
Yeah, and I would like to address some questions. I do not read them individually. They, in a way, relate to each other. And it is about the question, how do we differentiate the concept of ethical blindness to other concepts? And is every unethical behavior a result of ethical blindness? I think in a way we already addressed this question here or there in the videos, or maybe to some extent also in what we said during this hangout. But again, maybe it's one cannot say it often enough. Not every unethical behavior is due to ethical blindness. So you may behave unethical because you're a criminal, you're a crook, you're only looking for your own interest, you do not care about others. Maybe you do something unethical because you are afraid. That was, for instance, the question Nadia raised. But how is the state called if you are under pressure? So this is something where I would say, yeah, you yield to pressure, you're receiving orders, you may see the ethical dimensions, you may know that what you're doing is unethical, but it's sort of a cost-benefit analysis. You know, if I do not do it, what I'm asked for, I may have kill this other person. And soldiers are often in this situation. And many soldiers during wartime have been executed by their own troops because they refuse to fight. This is definitely not ethical blindness. They are just doing the cost-benefit analysis, and their own lives counts more for them than life of others, which is understandable. Another one is opportunism. They may seek advantages, but again, this is only looking for their own interests. And this is also a question that, or some of these questions point in this direction. Ethical is about taking others into account. It's about values. It's about being social. Yeah.
Titanium is asking whether someone who is, I read the question, if one is unaware of one's ethical blindness, does that mean we have no free will? Well, I guess these are not the same, points. Of course, we have a free will. And if you look at these experiments that we are going to talk about, where people are put in situations where they can do harm to others, for instance, you still have a high proportion of people who refuse to do so. We do not exactly know why they refuse and what the character differences are between the ones who refuse and those who obey. But what we know is that we are not machines. We can decide to behave ethically. What we need is courage. What we need is mindfulness, so the awareness for the context, the ability to not fall too easily into the trap of routines, to resist pressures. But in order to resist pressures, we have to know what kind of pressures exist. You have heard this in our video on compliance, where we argue that compliance as a method to fight against unethical decisions and corporations is not sufficient, because it is designed for criminals. It is not designed for good people doing wrong things because of strong contexts. If good people do wrong things because of their context, what we have to do, instead of giving them a code and showing them the torture instruments in the form of the punishments, what we have to do instead is to sensitize them for the psychology of context so that they can see it coming. That's the best weapon you have at your disposition to defend yourself. If you can see it coming, you can react early enough. If you can understand these psychological factors as a leader, you might avoid using them in the wrong way against your own intentions, maybe.
So here we have a question by Julian. To whom does an employee's loyalty lie, especially in whistleblowing situations? Organization or boss or self, public, society? Does a powerful organizational culture change the way an employee may react to situations involving wrongdoing? In a couple of days, I think in 2 days, we will upload our first debriefing video, and there we address it. But since the question comes here now in the Hangout, I would like to address it also here. Whistleblowing is an interesting topic with respect to our course, ethical blindness. Obviously, a whistleblower knows and is fully aware of the fact that there's something going wrong in the company, and wrong is now defined as from his inside perspective, the whistleblower perceives this as being unethically what's going on there. And this is in fact a conflict the whistleblower or the potential whistleblower has. If he's or she is looking at the company, it's of course straightforward not to blow the whistle because the company or the loyalty should be with the company. So he should or she should identify with what the company is doing and only consider this event that he has seen or what's going on in the company with respect to the company's interests. Now, it's a question, what horizon do you have? With a wider horizon, if you also take society into account, you may say, okay, my loyalty is not only with the company, but also with humankind in general. And here I cannot identify with what's going on in my company. And this may motivate such a person to blow the whistle in the interest of the common good, because this person believes he would help society improve things outside of the company. So it's the question whether you look at this with a narrow horizon or with a wider horizon. There is, of course, nothing I could now say, do this or that. Normally, of course, we all feel whistleblowing should be promoted because you have a more wider horizon. You are interested in the good of more people. So from a utilitarian perspective, I would say philosophers would agree that blowing the whistle is something that Bentham, for instance, would suggest, utilitarian. But of course, the company is closer to you. So this is a dilemma where you basically have the question, which perspective do you adapt? Kant, Bentham, or values?
There's a question from, if I read this Cyrillian name correctly, it's Victoria. How can I show in organization that authoritarian leadership style leads to unsuccessful organization in long-term perspective? As I said, we often systematically overestimate our own ability to resist evil in organizations. We think that bad things are done by bad people. We are good people, so we are not concerned by this. The best way of convincing someone that we are indeed concerned by this, we are vulnerable to it, is to get a deeper understanding of what we learn from the experiments that psychologists have done on authority pressure, on group pressure, on time pressure, on the effects of bonus systems, and all the other things that we have discussed and are going to discuss. I always say to my students here that watching one of these videos on conformity pressure or on authority pressure is much more useful to wake up people for ethical questions than talking 2 hours about Immanuel Kant. What can you do in your organization? Ask your managers to watch these videos of Milgram, of Solomon Asch, of Philip Zimbardo, and talk about the vulnerability of everyone for ethical blindness and the devastating impact aggressive and authoritarian leadership style can have on people.
We have a lecture on the power of strong context, in which we included these videos. So you will find pointers in, I think, 2 weeks. Yeah.
There was an interesting question on the forum, or not a question, more a critique, why our examples only involve men. And I'm not sure whether I have an answer for that, but if you look at most scandals that are in the media and that provide sufficient material to discuss them and to analyze them in the course of something like our seminar here, you will see that most of the time the people making the decisions and being involved are men. This might have many reasons. One of the reasons probably is that leadership positions in our society are most of the time taken by men. Another aspect that comes to my mind when I read this question is maybe the assumption that women would be different. They would make different decisions. Maybe if we had female traders in the banks, there would have been no financial scandal, or not the same kind of financial scandal. I'm not that sure. Because as we highlighted in our course, the ethical blindness concept is based not on questions about who you are, man, woman, young, old, dispositions of any kind, but where you are, in what kind of context you're embedded. So if you take a woman and embed the woman in the same kind of testosterone-driven trading floor context of a big bank or of Enron, you probably have the same results. And by the way, Stanley Milgram found no big differences between men and women when he did his electric shock experiments. Women killed as men killed.
I would like to add a comment on what Guido just said, and this comment is about selection bias. It may also be the case that there are more men in these positions because these are the stereotypes. Men are tougher, better fighters, whereas women here, the stereotype is maybe they better care, more social skills. And the world of business, and here's where frames kicks in. The world of business is a world where we have competitions and free markets, and this is our ideology. And this may, in a way, contribute to the fact that men, or at least the stereotypical man, has a better, how do we say, chance to survive there, or that these are the expectancies, the social norms. And there's a comment I would like to make on that. If we look at experiments done by behavioral economists who basically ask the question, are people socially oriented or selfishly oriented? They have this kind of experiment where you can give money to another person or keep it for yourself. What you find here is that there's a difference between disciplines, between faculties. And students of business and economics are more selfish than other students, for instance, from letters, from philosophy, from psychology. And interesting question, how do you explain this? There are two explanations. One explanation is there's some self-selection bias. Those who want to make a career in the world of business and have this idea in mind that you need to fight for profit, that this is what the game is about, and you have this elbow mentality, you're more likely to end up studying business compared to something else. So self-selection already right from the start. So there's a difference in the very first semester. And we do find evidence for that. The difference is already there. But then it's getting interesting when I tell you that the differences get even bigger over time. And here we again see how important framing is, because in business school, what do people hear all the time? They hear terms like profit, competition, market. So it is this social Darwinism doctrine and ideology that is communicated in a way, not only but dominantly in business schools. And with these frames, they leave the school, enter the world of business, and contribute to the game. And then, surprise, surprise, we have survival of the fittest, we have these free markets, we have liberalism out there in the world. And people, managers, may have a hard time to consider ethical dimensions because they are framed. And now the fault is not the manager's fault, but you should also, or could also, blame the business schools who contributed to this.
Yes, we come now to the end of our session. Our hour is over. We did this for the first time, and it's a challenge to read and think and speak at the same time, especially because normally we assume that men cannot do two things at the same time. But we had a team in the background. You cannot see them, but they are sitting right next to us, helping us with the questions. Maybe I can turn the camera for a moment. Here you see our team. It's hidden behind the microphone, but so we are not alone in this journey. We hope you enjoyed at least some of our spontaneous answers. You can listen to this again. We put this online. And yes, we continue to work with you in our seminar on the dark side of the force.
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone. And see you next week in the videos, in the forums, in the next debrief video, and I think we have one more hangout, right?
Yes, there will be a second one. So
you will
stay tuned.
receive information.